and welcome to Something's Off with Andrew Heaton. I'm your host, Andrew Heaton, and I think you're a terrific driver. I don't care what the cops say. You and I know better than them. And you guys, I am so excited to bring on my guest today. I'm going to do it here in a little bit after the advertisement, but I'm bringing on P.J. O'Rourke, who is my personal hero. I literally have a framed picture of this man on set behind me right now. He's one of 3 people that I've met over the course of my career that I have embarrassingly, visibly started shaking when I encountered them, because I am so impressed by the tenacity of this man's wit and the depth of his analysis. There aren't very many people on the planet that are as funny and smart as the guy that we're going to talk to here in a little bit. And so I am thrilled. He is, I think, a modern-day H.L. Mencken. And in fact, Cato, the Cato Institute agrees with me because he is the H.L. Mencken Fellow. And so a fantastic person to bring on. And something of a kickstart in my life, because I had got back from Edinburgh from getting my master's degree. I was back in D.C., and I stumbled upon the book Parliament of Whores, and it, by him, by the way, and it had a profound impact on me, both in terms of how I interpret politics, but it had 2 cascading effects. One, I went, oh, you don't have to be a Democrat to be funny? I just sort of assumed that was a rule. And here's this guy openly flouting that. And then the second thing is, I went, oh, I could combine politics with humor? That had not occurred to me, and that's basically my career at this point. So what I'm saying is, if I'm Spider-Man, then P.J. O'Rourke is Uncle Ben. Now, my producer reminded me when I came up with this analogy this morning that Uncle Ben does get shot. And I don't want that to happen to P.J. O'Rourke, but I do want to be H.L. Mencken scholar. So if we at some point shifted into like a Sith metaphor, maybe I will overtake him, but not for another 20 years, because my wit is just not ready to grapple with this man. So I'll bring him on in a minute. But before we do that, we still got to pay those bills, don't we? And that means a word from our sponsor. Something's Off with Andrew Heaton is brought to you by the unextinguishable log from Taylor Fuels. Just try to put that log out. You can't. It's your 7-year anniversary. After a nice dinner at an unspecified restaurant, which may or may not involve horses, you proceed home for a romantic evening. Sure, the romance is different now. When you first got married, it was exciting and sexy. Sometimes she'd wear crazy underwear or surprise you at work wearing a trench coat with nothing underneath, down at the trench coat factory where you work. And you'd do little romantic gestures for her, too. Bring her flowers for no reason, or shoot a deer on your way home from the office. Maybe surprise her with blood diamonds. 7 years in, it's a comfortable relationship. You've traded excitement for intimacy and familiarity. You still have a lover, but now she's a companion as well. So when you get home from dinner, you wordlessly hang up your trench coat and light a fire in the hearth. Oh, how lovely, dear, she says, snuggling up on the couch. I do so love a good fire. Yes, you say. I know. What a wonderful representation of the warm, cozy relationship we've built together. And that's when the fire craps out. It even gasps and coughs a little, concluding with a tiny, impudent smoke fart. Your wife stares at the lifeless, rote, depressing hunk of failure wood, and she starts to cry. Don't worry, darling, you say. It was just a dud batch of non-name brand logs. I'll light another one. But she won't stop crying. Jim, she says, I'm pregnant. And it's not your baby. It's Melissa's. Wait a minute. Did you say Melissa? That fire, says your wife, is a metaphor for our cold, lifeless relationship. The hearth is the altar of domesticity, and we can't keep the fire burning in ours. Is Melissa the brunette from our bridge club? Is that the Melissa we're talking about? Melissa understands me, she says. I excite her. Our forbidden romance ignites our hearts and loins, exactly the opposite of the fire in yours and my relationship and the literal fire that just went out on our hearth. Right. And you're pregnant? With Melissa's baby? How does that work exactly? You can't keep a fire going, Jim, she says. I guess that explains a lot, doesn't it? You just can't figure out how to keep passion revved up. I'm leaving you. I'm moving in with Melissa to raise our forbidden love child. Okay, that's fine, you say. I'm just very confused as to where this baby came from. Like, are you participating in an experimental procedure, or did you both agree to, for some reason, seek out an unrelated sperm donor? What's happening? "You just don't get it, do you, Jim?" says your wife. "You can't figure out how a baby works, just like you can't figure out how to make a decent fire." Guess you should have bought one of Taylor Fuel's unextinguishable logs when you had the chance. Every unextinguishable log burns for several hours, whether you want it to or not. Rain, snow, liquid, cement, argon. Throw whatever you want on it. You're not going to extinguish it. You'll just piss it off. Non-name brand logs crap out on you like expired batteries or a friend you asked to pick you up at the airport. But you can count on Taylor Fuel unextinguishable logs to burn hot and bright and true to the very, very end. The unextinguishable log from Taylor Fuels. We didn't start the fire, but we sure as hell can't stop it. My guest today is PJ ORourke. PJ, thank you for coming on.
You're very welcome, and that's the best ad I've ever heard in my life.
Thank you. I pride myself on helping our sponsors make good ads, and I stand behind every product that's on the show. Thank you. And today I wanted to talk to you specifically about your book on the Wealth of Nations, because you did a whole biopic, or not biopic, you did a whole rundown of Adam Smith and the impact that he made economically on the world. And I thought, in addition to wanting to speak to you in general, that seems like a positive and needed message in today's environment.
Much more so, actually, than when I wrote the book, when the basic tenets of Adam Smith seemed to be accepted by practically everybody, including the Communist Party of China. But yeah, what I did was I read The Wealth of Nations, all 900 pages of it, and all the sort of commentary on it, and pretty much everything else Adam Smith wrote, so that you wouldn't have to.
Thank you. Oh, thank you very much.
Well, it was a bit of a slog. Actually,
you even have a chapter in there about why it's so long. There's like a full chapter on this is why it's so long.
The graph hadn't been invented. There are whole chunks. There's like one 75-page section about the price of silver over time, which Smith's point is that silver, like anything else, it's a commodity, like pork bellies, and I suppose in his day, hogsheads.
Yeah.
And one graph would have shown this, but they hadn't been invented, and so he had to take 75 pages.
Well, and he's also writing for a different time and a different audience too, right? Like I don't know what the literacy rates were in Britain at the time, but I think you pointed out in the book that the amount of people purchasing books was a fairly small portion of the population.
Yeah, functionally the literacy rate was none. I mean, when you were writing a book in the 18th century, you were writing a book basically for people you knew. I mean,
so it's a blog.
Everybody who could read a big fat book about the theory of economics, you'd either met them or you'd met somebody who'd met them, or they were somebody you'd met, friend's cousin. You know, I mean, basically you knew exactly to whom you were speaking.
So what is the intellectual landscape of Scotland, Britain, America when Adam Smith steps into the fore? Because I think there's probably a lot of elements of Smith that we take for granted now that were, I imagine, earth-shattering at the time. So what did it look like?
They absolutely were. I mean, he saw three things that would seem self-evident to anybody today. Not that we always act on these principles, but sort of like the Ten Commandments. You know, I mean, we all know what they are. We're all pretty much agreed that they're good commandments, and we violate them every day.
Yeah.
Honor thy father and thy mother, and put them in a nursing home. He had three basic things. One is that trying to better yourself in the world is a good thing. That, you know, trying to get ahead in the world, trying to do something, make a difference. There is nothing wrong. There's nothing inherently wrong with self-interest. Self-interest is not the same thing as selfishness. And we think, well, of course, people are self-interested. You know, even all those wonderful people out there who want to save the world. You know, they're interested in becoming the next president of the United States in 2020 or something.
Yeah.
I don't know. Of course, they're self-interested.
Or they're doing a lot of really good work in terms of raising social awareness on Facebook, but they're still planning on going on a trip to Italy this summer. There's still some room for them.
Yeah, but they're always self-interested, and they're interested in getting more Facebook followers by noisily virtue signaling on social media. But at the time when in the 18th century, we still had the leftover of sort of a medieval point of view that, like, God put you on earth in a certain station and you were supposed to know your place and stay in your place, and, like, being ambitious in any way was against the will of God and the rules of society, and peasants should stay out in the mud and kings should stay on their thrones, and merchants were to be deeply suspected because they bought low and they sold high, and they obviously were wicked people to do so. So he's operating. He overturns that assumption, which was already on its way out. People like Benjamin Franklin were already disproving that sort of idea. But then Smith goes on to talk about not so much whether we should be self-interested and try and get ahead in the world, but how we should do so. And he basically discovers the idea of what we would call specialization, what he called division of labor. He realizes, and it seems remarkably thick-headed of mankind that nobody had, twigged to this yet, but that one person on his own, Smith uses the example of a pin. It would, if you were trying to make a pin all by yourself, you'd have to start out by mining the pin ore, iron ore, I guess.
No, I think you're right. It's pin ore. The pin mines. That's why Philadelphia's doing, or pin mines.
Yeah, right. It could be around. We don't know. Anyway, the process of making a pin all by yourself would be and you produce one pin a year. You have to dig up the ore and smelt the ore and pound it into wire and sharpen it at one end and put a little button on the other and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I would just go nude.
Yeah, exactly. And then he comes to so he's got this specialization thing going on, and it's it's basically the idea is that this has been going on forever, since the cavemen. The little fellow with the big ideas chips the spear points, the courageous oaf spears the mammoth, and the artistic type does a lovely cave painting of it all. And what that does, though, is lead us inexorably to trade freedoms, to free market. One person makes a thing, another person makes another thing, and everybody wants everything. And so you got to trade. You've got to come up with some sort of method of exchange, and that's of course
at the time that he's. Go ahead. Sorry.
I said that's where Smith starts to refute the current economic idea of the 18th century was mercantilism. The idea was for countries to accumulate. Countries got rich by accumulating gold, by accumulating silver and rubies and diamonds and other precious things.
Yeah.
And Smith is saying, wait a minute, that's not how people get rich. Now, look, the trade may have been a stupid trade. Now, viewing a cave painting, that cannot be worth 300 pounds of mammoth ham,
Yeah, of course.
It may have been a lopsided trade. Starving cave artist gorges himself for months while a courageous oaf of a new art patron stands scratching his head in a Paleolithic grotto. And what about that wily spearpoint chipper? He doubtless took his mammoth cut, But the participants in this free trade, they didn't ask us. It's up to them to figure this out. So the trade is not only a thing that's necessary to economic growth, but it's a fundamental human freedom. We are not free people without a free market.
And that was, I'll kind of jumping ahead. One of the things that I got out of your book that would not have occurred to me, and I didn't know, because a lot of the terms that you're using, I'm familiar with, like division of labor. You get into GDP, you get into things like, I think comparative advantage, definitely marginal utility. One of the things that I thought was really interesting is the idea that capitalism itself is a way of bifurcating power and money from one another. That when we were in the feudal ages, you had land, and that translated directly to power and money, and they were all kind of the same thing. Whereas once you've got a market system in place where you can accumulate capital, it doesn't necessarily mean that you become duke or governor. You might, but at the same time, Howard Schultz probably won't become CEO. And I thought this idea of a division of power and capitalism, being able to create that was a pretty good boon for capitalism.
It was a huge boon for civil society, that the most important people in our society are not the people who are most important in our political system. In fact, if you look at our politicians, and I'm going to be completely nonpartisan about that, if you look at our politicians, what you see is a bunch of second-rate idiots. I mean, no offense to the guy that the White House is at the moment, but I'll take the Pritzker family in Chicago over him over on the real estate development front any day of the week. And I was just looking up Bernie Sanders to give an example from the other side, and I realized that he's never done anything in his life.
I think, didn't he get kicked out of a commune because he wouldn't shut up? He, instead of working, it's not corroborated, I should say, but I've read some things where he was in a commune, and I assume the 60s or 70s, and they kicked him out because he kept talking about socialism instead of actually working and gardening.
Instead of washing the dishes.
Yeah, which I think is just a great encapsulation of Bernie Sanders. Is it won't actually roll the sleeves to do the work.
Of all politicians, in a way, is that everybody wants to save the world. No one wants to help mom with the dishes.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really very fundamental. He was a carpenter, although the idea of living in a house built by Bernie is a pretty scary thing. I think briefly a carpenter. He was mayor of Burlington. He's mayor of Burlington,
and he
Vermont.
put out. Have you heard his folk album?
No.
I will.
And God spare me. I hope I never shall.
It is. Yeah. It is. It sounds like a cutaway from Arrested Development. It's Bernie Sanders and he can't sing, so he's doing that kind of William Shatner after a couple of NyQuil's type recitative, where he's just like monologuing, and this land is our land, this land is your land, and he's doing that, but he's got all of these folk singers from Vermont in the background, like really singing. It's amazing. It's like I wish he would put out another album. I would like that more. What I just can't.
Yeah, he was one more sort of smart ass from New York, like coming up. I live in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. We tend to keep those people out a little more.
So you're in like the bizarro world of Vermont, right? Like Vermont looks the same, but you guys have guns or something.
Vermont is bizarro world. New Hampshire is New England. But he's like Ben and Jerry, except no ice cream, or free ice cream for everybody.
Yeah, free Medicare for all the people of the world. Everyone in the world gets Medicare.
Anyway, we're getting a little off the point. So it's wonderful in society to divide power and prestige along other lines besides, actual political power. Now, the church did that to a certain extent. The church had power and prestige, but that was like a monolithic and autocratic institution as opposed to ordinary parts of civil society. When you get just plain rich people, well, sure, they act up sometimes and, pay $250,000 to pretend their kid plays lacrosse. Our kids are going to somewhat less prestigious. I've offered $25.
But that is a phenomenon, and you kind of chart that through the book, and so does Adam Smith. That there is this sort of I think now we tend to view if you're more progressive oriented, you see the Howard Schultzes of the world, the Bill Gateses of the world as these kind of neo-feudal robber barons, and because they have money, they have power, and therefore we've got this old model. Whereas the historical separation that occurs is that you've got the old landed gentry who really isn't thinking, like they viewed accumulation of wealth, the actual act of accumulating wealth, as dirty, and didn't want to deal with the numbers. And then you had the burghers, who were the upper middle class town merchants that just they wanted to pay a flat tax and then pay their commerce, and they were vying against each other. So you had the sort of old landed power against the new up and comers, and that because they were vying for control of the institutions. They ultimately kind of downplayed power itself as a political concept.
Yeah, well, they kind of had to. I mean, if free market distributes power very broadly, and really the most powerful people in the free market are just us ordinary folks who are like buying stuff at Walmart. If we don't buy it, things go to hell. If we do buy it, somebody gets rich. But the money doesn't translate directly into power, or Mitt Romney would be president today.
Or Steve Forbes.
Guy, And the whole idea of that rich people are buying political power. Watch what happens to Howard Schultz's presidential campaign should he attempt to run as an independent.
I kind of like the guy. I don't think he's going to have a very good run.
Not?
Yeah. I think you're right about that. That's one of the. I think that the cry for campaign finance reform has been muted somewhat over the last couple of years, and I'm pleased by that development, because if you could just purchase, Congress seats and things like that, you could just buy them. I would be flat out against that, of course. But I think that the more you increase that. The amount of campaign finance reform that happens, I think you're going to see two things. One, you're going to have more and more of a divorce between the political action committee and the candidate, so that you can have a political action committee go rogue and be terrible, even if the candidate's nice.
Some of the political action committees are nuts beyond belief.
Right. Yeah, and I don't think to Bernie Sanders' credit, he did run a clean campaign. It was a very uplifting campaign. But if you've got, say, angry socialist PAC that's kneecapping other candidates. And then the other thing is, I think if you have really stringent campaign finance reform, I think you're going to get more Donald Trumps, because at that point you can't purchase ad campaigns. You just need to get attention.
Yes, yeah. I mean, earned media, as they call it.
Yeah.
So the loudest, the noisiest person and it doesn't matter. We're not talking ideology here. It really doesn't matter whether they come from the left or the right. You will get work. You'd actually perfect campaign finance reform, which of course would come down to we, the taxpayers, paying jerks to make fools of themselves.
And I'm sure that they would take into account that I'm an independent and allow me to have my money go to a non-Republican or Democrat. I'm sure they'd be great about that.
Yeah, I'm sure the libertarianism would really sort of a kind of
Oh, they'd just give the libertarians 33%. That'd be the fair thing, wouldn't it? Yeah, they'd absolutely do that.
It would. And so that would be one bad part of it. But the other one you just pointed out is that the noisiest, strangest, and weirdest people would rise to the top, which seems to be happening anyway. Actually, I'm wondering if maybe we shouldn't just sell the houses in the seat in the House of seats in the House of Representatives and seats in the Senate. First place, we'd make some money.
Yeah, we could pay off that debt.
Second place, will we really wind up with worse people than we've got already?
You make a fair point. And just to play,
you can just buy it.
To play devil's advocate for a minute. So this idea that that the free market and capitalism are better at distributing power and splitting power for money. My friends that are Sanders supporters in New York would say that if you have a socialist government or socialist economic program, that it's going to better redistribute money, and money equals power, and therefore you're going to have a more egalitarian society. What would your response to that be?
Be careful what you wish for. Any kind of socialism, sweet as the idea may be that, we should help the poor and life should be fairer and it shouldn't rain on weekends and all the good ideas that we have. Any form of this creates a very, very big government. We got a huge government as it is, but it would require. But if we institute free college education for everybody and Medicare for all and universal basic income, that government is going to grow beyond huge. I just did a little math on just UBI and Medicare for all would require an annual federal budget of $11.1 trillion, which is creeping up on our entire GDP.
Okay, so we would be able to do Medicare and we'd be able to do college, but then after that we get like $1,000 budget for other things throughout the year.
The military.
Yeah, we get a tank, and then you and I could buy like pretzels. but we get free college.
Yeah, and Marine Corps, here's $100. Go kill ISIS. But the main thing is that we create this huge political establishment, this gigantic government. Hey, and what if a nut got control of it? What if we elected a loony? This is what I always tell my leftist friend. What if we elected a loony person president?
Can you imagine? Like if we got like a washed-up game show host?
It would never happen.
Yeah, no, of course not.
Just what if?
It'll always be a very erudite, pleasant Ivy League person who's a smooth talker in a sweater vest. It would never be, like the P.T. Barnum of American politics.
With an extra high opinion of himself, but it would never be an outright nut.
Well, to pivot to Trump for a minute, do you think he's a mercantilist?
Oh, I don't think Trump. I think Trump is a man free of theory.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. But you know what? But I'll say though, the weird thing about Trump is that the only two positions that he seems to consistently have is one, I'm awesome. He's always adopted that, right?
On that.
But then the other one is that, because I've gone back and looked through this, the only ideological position that he seems to continuously endorse is this idea that tariffs are good and that trade deficits are bad. It's so weird that he's glommed onto that one thing.
He is a mercantilist because mercantilism is kind of an instinctual thing.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about how people think about how people think about economics. All the economics we see around us, everything from steam engines to modern monetary theory or something, that's all like brand new. Our gut is based in a million years of human existence, which was zero sum, which was all based on land, either land to hunt on or land to gather on or land to grow things on. And land is a fixed asset. Land that I've got is land you can't have, and vice versa.
Right.
So we all have, in our heart of hearts, a zero-sum attitude toward the economy. If Howard Schultz has got a lot of money, it's because he took it from me. Which he did, but only $5 at a time.
Yeah, you voluntarily gave him that cash, yeah.
I did, too, yeah. Actually, I didn't. I don't even like Starbucks.
Yeah, me neither. I think it tastes like hot rust. I'm not a Starbucks fan.
Yeah, it's not really, better than Dunkin' Donuts, but just.
Oh, no, I like weak drip gas station coffee, but I'm getting away from it, yeah.
Old-fashioned American coffee that has no coffee in it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so we all have this feeling, and it's a very, very hard thing to get rid of. To understand that that the economy, it's not a pizza. It's not a pizza where if I have too many slices, you have to eat the Domino's box. We can bake more pizza.
And is that something that Smith got? He got the idea of comparative wealth versus absolute wealth versus proportional
relative
wealth?
And Smith was really the first person to understand that an economy is not a fixed amount of money. It's not a certain amount of gold that you've got buried in the castle, a treasure room. That wealth is the interchange of goods and services among people. So Smith basically invented the concept of gross domestic product.
Hats off. That's a very useful thing. That's a very useful intellectual tool.
Previously, nations measured their wealth basically by how much treasure was locked up in the Tower of London, where it's not doing anything.
So he gets the GDP going, and this is something that I'm still trying to. I take it that he was probably not concerned with trade deficits. And balance of trade and that kind of thing. The occupant of the White House is very concerned about it.
He goes on about it at considerable length. But basically he says, when somebody's selling you something too cheaply, buy it! Because they're suckers. You're taking it away from them,
Yeah.
So if China says, we're going to dump aluminum on the American market. Look, quick, buy up that aluminum. China's like hurting nobody but themselves.
Yeah.
We're going to sell aluminum for less than it costs to produce it. Excellent business plan. Count me in. I'll buy the aluminum. Smith was, of course, aware, as any good economist ought to be, that the growth of trade is a good thing in general, inherently, and but that it's going to cause local dislocations.
Okay, yeah.
And
so there are going to be some American aluminum manufacturers that are put out by that, but the net benefit will be worth it.
And some workers are going to lose their jobs and so on. And I think it's incumbent upon us to recognize that sort of thing and make sure that other opportunities are available. It's never going to be perfect. Mm-hmm. But the overall benefits of free trade far outweigh the local dislocations, even though if you're personally the person who's dislocated, as I have been as a print journalist, for instance, my business went down the toilet. But do I really want to, revert to messengers carrying what I write, but in forked sticks? Just to save my job would be a little selfish of me.
Yeah, well, and you can also go the other way too. Like if the government doesn't just exist to protect you from violence or to protect you from violence, protect you from theft, enforce contracts, all the kind of basic things that classical liberalism would extol as the responsibility of government.
Rule of law.
Right, rule of law. If it goes beyond that to it has an obligation to protect your job from competition, then it becomes very difficult to mediate. Well, what if it's protecting? What if I am also a citizen and I want to compete with this person? I've got a different business model. So is it just going to always default on the incumbent? That way we hinder progress. Would it then not be a good idea to go ahead and have protectionism on a state-by-state level? That way...
exactly. It's a slippery... It's that famous slippery slope down which we're not supposed to go. Yeah, and another thing about... looping back to what we were talking about creating a gigantic government, is that besides the danger of a gigantic government getting captured by an idiot or a group of idiots, there is...
Perish the thought.
There's also just the thing that if you task the government with doing everything, including protecting your job at the aluminum mill, you're going to get a government that does nothing well. I mean, it's a marriage. We're kind of married to the government. And if I say to my wife, "Okay, well, we got married. You'll raise the kids, of course, and do the grocery shopping and the cooking, house cleaning, and then it's modern times, so you're going to have a career too. So you'll bring home the bacon, and you'll mow the lawn and tend to the garden and cut and split the wood, and I'll watch sports on TV."
Yeah. Sweet deal.
Now, that division of labor is A, not going to lead to a very happy marriage, and B, my wife as in her role as wife and mother is not going to be able to do any of those things very well.
Mm. Although there was kind of, with Smith, he kind of had an idea of, it seemed to me, benign neglect. He wasn't an anarchist nor a libertarian in the modern sense. He did think there should be a government, but I get the impression that he kind of wanted the government to either be kind of dumb, or he kind of wanted it to focus on other things. That way the market could prosper without a lot of attention.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you just there was not at the moment in China, which seems to be taking a new sort of authoritarian, even Maoist turn. But back about 10 years ago, I was in mainland China, and I remember whether it was Hu Jintao or whether Deng was still in power. At any rate, it was a while back, and when I would talk to the Chinese about politics, and they were not shy about talking about politics, but their general political message was, "Shh, the government is sleeping." Or there's actually a Chinese sort of aphorism about that. The mountains are high, the emperor is far away.
Yeah. Well, then they've got free economic zones. It's one of the big innovations they've had is let Hong Kong do whatever it wants, and then they've got like whole cities that they've designated where they're basically like don't murder anybody, but otherwise we're not, like for this particular city, there's going to be no regulations. And it's how their economy's
Except
afloat.
they're kind of going back on that nowadays, and like banning Winnie the Pooh because he looks a little too much like...
Right, yeah. Authoritarian regime's always going to be authoritarian, and they're leaning back into that.
They can't help themselves. The temptation is the tools are at hand, and the temptation to use them is too much. It's like giving a gun to a 10-year-old, or my old metaphor from Parliament of Horrors is that giving money and power to government is like giving whiskey and car keys to teenage boys.
Yeah.
That was long before I had a teenage boy. Now that I've got one, I think, you were righter than you ever knew.
Look at some of those robot cars. With China, the best argument I can think of in favor of the tariffs that the president is attempting to steep up or keep in place, because there are all these Republicans who purport to be free marketers that have got behind Trump in terms of tariffs with China. And the best argument that I could make on their behalf is that it's a temporary measure to try and force the Chinese to abandon unfair business practices like flouting intellectual property rights and things like that. Do you think there's much to that? Or
actually, I do, as a matter of fact. While I'm a little alarmed by and a little put off by our president's style of doing things, a number of our trade agreements around the world were disadvantageous, were not fair, as we may say, and needed a little shaking up. And, his way of going about it might actually work, or it might backfire terribly. I don't know. I cannot see into the future. But, I think he may have thrown a little, this might work out all right. He may have thrown a little scare into the Chinese and might think about it. The real problem with China is that they are... the intellectual property thing, they're sort of getting over now that they have their own intellectual property. But basically, they would like to open our market to them while closing their market to us. And they need to rethink that.
Well, and I would think that long term that's not going to help them tremendously anyway, because it's that.
No, it's actually not a good strategy. We're doing them a favor. When we give them the spanking, we can say, if parents spanked anymore, all spanking parents say, this is hurting me more than it's hurting you.
Mm-hmm. So I want to back up, because another kind of fundamental precept to Smith and capitalism is the idea of property rights. So kind of give me an idea of how Smith viewed property and how the market system that he helped put into place is built on that.
Yeah, well, I think he was one of the first people to discern that property extended beyond that gut level idea of it just being land. To this day, when we trade in land, we call it real estate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and yet, if anybody were to look at the estates that we actually have, what we would leave in a will, very little of it would have to do with land. Maybe, it might be a house, might be, but land as a productive resource, how many of us are leaving farms to our children, pasture land, and so on and so forth?
Yeah.
But we've got this idea so Smith was right in the forefront of understanding property as being more than simply piled up treasure or ownership of land. I don't know if he got quite to the point of intellectual property, because he lived sort of just on the verge of the Industrial Revolution. So
wasn't he friends with James Watt?
Just before the explosion in invention at the Industrial Revolution.
I think you point that out in the book, that he was buddies with James Watt, who invented the steam engine.
And he actually invested in a couple of other ideas Watt had. One for a kind of primitive Xerox, which where if I sat down and wrote you a letter, this machine would make 3 or 4 or 5 copies of that letter automatically.
Although in Smith's case, he thought that he was at the end of the Industrial Revolution, that the big jumps had already happened technologically.
He did. He thought, division of labor had been pretty well perfected, and so he was. The man was a theorist, not not a particularly practical person, and so he was. He kind of missed the most important thing that was going on economically, the most important physical thing. But it just goes to show you that ideas really matter, because his analysis of economics turned out to be actually more important than physical inventions, which probably would have happened anyway.
Sure. Well, like on that note, so I feel like one of the basic tenets of classical liberalism is that you own you. You are your own property, and it's kind of the atomic unit of property. As you start with you and you kind of work out. Did he go that far? Did he kind of have like a philosophical bent with it?
He did. See, now one of the things that's interesting about the Wealth of Nations and about how people read it or read extracts of it is that some people would say, "Oh, well, Smith just really didn't address the morality of slavery." I mean, when he talks about slavery in the Wealth of Nations, he talks about how economically inefficient it is. How
what a dork! That's where he goes to.
Somebody,
slaves are bad for business. There's other stuff too.
Slaves are bad for business. I mean, if you own somebody and you give them a crappy place to live and as little food as you can get away with, and a bit of your cast-off clothing, and then you ask them to work really hard for you, how hard are they going to work?
Bare minimum.
Bare minimum,
yeah.
Absolute bare minimum, and who can blame them one bit? But what people don't understand when they look at that, they say, well, that's a pretty cold-blooded argument against slavery. I mean, it may be right, but it's hardly cuts to the moral core of the horror of one person owning another person.
Yeah.
And the reason for that was that Smith wrote a book called Theory of Moral Sentiments before The Wealth of Nations. It was a huge bestseller in its time. And he considered it much the more important book, actually, than Wealth of Nations. And he assumed, probably rightly, that almost everybody who read The Wealth of Nations had already read the Theory of Moral Sentiments. And the Theory of Moral Sentiments is about how our conscience comes to be. It's sort of like, I would call it the mechanical engineering of the Holy Ghost, in a way. You know,
okay.
How is it we know right from wrong? And why do we act upon that? Why and in what way do we act upon that knowledge? And in that book, he just brings the guns down to deck level and loads with grape on the subject of slavery. I mean, he devastated the idea that there was anything even remotely morally acceptable about slavery. So he considered that task done.
Right. Okay. So he's got that, but kind of extending out from that, then does he thinks that, say, you need to own yourself as a basic moral tenet, but it's also an economic tenet. Does he
absolutely,
kind of like lay foundations for Hayek? Do they have a connection between the two? Did Hayek? I assume Hayek read him, but did he? Tend to like him in that regard?
I would say so. With one exception, is that Smith is so committed to the idea of self-ownership that he comes up with and influences. He comes up with an idea that's at the heart of Marxism, and Adam Smith, oddly enough, was a very strong influence on Marx, which is the labor theory of value.
Which is one of the big things he gets wrong, in my opinion, because it's a fairly walloping economic thing. Yeah.
It was David Hume, who was his best friend. David Hume said in his writing to Smith after The Wealth of Nations came, after he'd seen the manuscript of Wealth of Nations, and he says, it's a great book, it's done some wonderful thing. He said, I have to worry about your whole theory of price, how you're trying to figure out the inherent value of an object or a service or something, based on the amount of labor that goes into it and so on and so forth. He said, Hume said, the price of things is what people will pay for them.
Right. Okay.
End of argument.
Yeah, I think he nailed it.
Yeah, but Smith is a little bit too much of an intellectual to just let it go at that. There are some that the price of things the price of a thing is simply what people will pay for it. Is one of those things. I mean, when you've probably gone house shopping or car shopping.
I've been car shopping. I thank you for thinking I'm the kind of person who would own his own home. Someday I'll get there. But I do have my own car after 30 more payments.
It's a wonderful experience if you like throwing money down the basement stairs. But it's one of those things where you go, now what is this house really worth? Well, it's really worth what somebody will pay for it.
Right.
And it's one of those, any thinking person, even if they're just thinking about buying a house, any thinking person just has trouble letting that go.
Well, I think you're right. I think a lot of economics is a counterintuitive way of thinking. Economics is not built on what feels natural to us. And
no, it often isn't. Although it's surprising how much of it is simple common sense.
Right. Yeah. Then you think it's all simple common sense, you'll stumble across something like Ricardo's principle of comparative advantage, which makes no sense at all. But still good economics. But with labor theory of value, I got into a really nerdy argument with one of my former roommates back when I lived in New York here a few years ago, where I had done an unrelated video for a series I used to do on economics called Econ Pop, and we were going over the labor theory of value, and I was explaining it to him that according to the labor theory of value, which Smith had some variant endorsement of, the idea that an object is worth the labor someone put into it, which my friend who was installing sprinkler systems at the time was very much in favor of. He thought he should be paid based on the amount of toil he put into it. But if you extend that to any other category, then if I work harder on a car, even if it's a worse car, the car should be worth more. Or if I have a faulty submarine with like it has leaks in it, but I worked really hard on it, that submarine should still be worth more than like an easy-made IKEA submarine that doesn't sink.
It doesn't really work out when you try to follow through. It's one of those things that sort of feels instinctively right. Mm-hmm. But if it actually were true, gosh, do I have some valuable shelves in the garage?
I was about to say, my books are worth so much more than that I am selling them for if it's based on the effort rather than what I think I can hawk about.
Not to mention I'm thinking of the chickens in my chicken coop, the firewood in my woodshed. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
No.
What are some? I mean, because Smith did come up with all of these things that were a good sea shift for global economics, but in particular the Anglosphere. What were some of the things he got wrong? He got labor theory of value wrong. Are there any other big canards that he got over the course of his thinking?
No, surprisingly not. Although when he attempts to apply his theory to what the government might actually do, the results are sort of mediocre. But I don't think he comes out with anything that is that really screams wrong.
Okay.
And even with his attempt at the sort of primitive analysis of labor theory of value, it really is just part and parcel of him puzzling over the nature of price. Okay. And David Hume would say, "Stop puzzling. There's nothing to figure out. It's it is. It's like love,
Yeah.
But even there, he's not really wrong. He's just engaged in looking at it from every angle, and it was Marx who was wrong.
Yes.
No, so Smith doesn't often come up absolutely wrong about things.
How would he?
Now there are places where you would take issue with him, perhaps. Smith, for instance, was in favor of a graduated income tax.
Really? That's well ahead of its day, I would think. That sounds very different than 1776.
Ted Cruz or Steve Forbes. But Smith put it this way. He said, one of the fundamental tasks of government is to protect property.
Yeah.
And he said when a person has a great deal of property, they derive much more benefit from government than a person with no property, and therefore it's not only should they be taxed more, which being richer they naturally would be, but they might well be taxed at a higher rate due to the fact that they're making greater use of government. Now, of course, government these days has gone off on so many tangents and decided to do so many other things that I'm not sure Smith's argument for graduated income tax still holds.
Well, at the time that he was writing, I'm guessing that what would have been considered a valid range of income tax would have been like, sure, like we're going to tax everybody 1%, but if you're wealthy, we're going to charge you like 4%.
Yeah,
and something like that.
In point of fact, there were no income taxes.
Right. Yeah.
There were various duties and imposts and fees and so on, much like in most of U.S. history up until the end of the 19th century, up until World War I, really.
Does he? How would he sit with, say, a modern economist today? Like, if say Paul Krugman and the Force ghost of Milton Friedman were summoned to hang out, would he prefer one over the other? Would he just be in a whole different category?
I mean, he and Milton Friedman are very much on the same wavelength. Although Friedman, I shouldn't say although. Friedman and Smith both regarded their work as primarily practical.
Okay.
I mean, like I said, Smith had already done his moral thinking in the theory of moral sentiments, and he regarded The Wealth of Nations as like sort of a how-to manual. What makes one nation rich and another nation not rich, and how can we go about being that nation that becomes rich, and so on. And so he and Hayek would, I don't know what he would make of Paul Krugman, who's, I've never quite been able to figure out Krugman's economics, and I'm not sure they're actually particularly interesting or startling, or there's anything new in them. They do
vary tremendously depending on whether or not there's a Democrat in the White House, I found. His position on deficits and debts changes depending on if he likes the guy.
That Krugman has used his supposed expertise in economics to build a little platform for himself where he gets to be Paul Krugman.
Yeah.
And that seems to be the main point of most of his columns, is him bloviating about one issue or another.
Yeah, I agree.
Rather than anything that's, the modern writer about economics who isn't actually an economist, he's a business reporter, turned columnist, is Robert Samuelson.
I'll check him out.
Robert Samuelson is brilliant. He is absolutely great. And he doesn't proceed from any particular economic theory. He's just a great analyst of what's going on, I mean, if you've got a big question like, should we break up Google, Robert Samuelson's the guy to go to.
I will add him to my list. And then
he's good. He's really good. And he's a great writer. He's sort of like the he's not as conservative as George Will, but he's sort of like the George Will of economics.
Given that I have a George Will is my dashboard saint. I will,
he's a great guy.
Absolutely check him out on that then. So we're rounding up towards the end of the program. A final question on Adam Smith. He publishes The Wealth of Nations in 1776. So it's either 75 or 76, but it's right up
76,
there.
76,
76, that's what I thought. So it's right there at the time of the American Revolution. What is his impact on the United States? Did he? I would imagine at the time that we weren't reading that real closely, given that we weren't over in Edinburgh's Scottish Enlightenment. We were kind of busy doing our own thing. But I feel like we've sort of absorbed him into the economic bones of the country since then.
His influence would in the United States would come later. The United States in 1776 was still very much such an agrarian society, and I would say the sort of Hamiltonian American system ideas would have been rather contrary to. I haven't been able to find any evidence that our founding fathers were familiar with Smith, and if they were, it was with the theory of moral sentiments.
Right.
But they don't really seem to have been familiar with The Wealth of Nations, and so it has surprisingly little influence on. But it really wasn't until the birth of classical liberalism, getting toward the end of the 19th century, that Smith's full effects start. He was a man well ahead of his time. Now, what's interesting was he advised the British government, strongly advised the British government, not to get in this fight with the colonists. He envisioned Great Britain, the 13 colonies, as a sort of future part of Great Britain, and he postulated that there might come a day when it was so much more prosperous and populated in the colonies, that the seat of government of the British Empire might move to the colonies.
New York would be Parliament. Yeah, I met a guy. I was hanging out at the. I used to live in Britain. I go back every year, and I was hanging out at the Liberal.
Yeah, it's a great place. I love it there myself.
Yeah, I had to meet an agent in London, but I had a day to kill, so I was hanging out at the Liberal Club. Which is where half of the British prime ministers used to go smoke cigars there, and I struck up a conversation with a gentleman from Gloucester, and he posited that basically America and Britain were the eastern and western halves of the British Empire. And he thought that he viewed me very much as cousins with him in terms of politics. And he thought that had we not had the American Revolution, he thought that eventually New York or some other American city would have become the seat of the empire, and it would have, Hail Britannia would have been going on in North America. And I guess Smith was kind of that camp.
It's a very nice thought. Another big fan of that idea was Henry James, who thought there should be a union of English-speaking countries. And, the damn flat truth of the matter is that those countries most closely connected by ideas to the motherland, to Britain, are among the very few free and reliably politically, I don't quite want to say moderate, but, reasonably moderate. I mean, Canada, the Five Eyes, Canada and New Zealand, Australia, the United States, Canada. Wait a minute, there's 6 of them.
Both Canadas, all 2 of them.
Yeah. These constitute, I don't think it's exaggerating to say these constitute the best countries in the world.
Okay.
And it would be nice if they were,
I'd say I would feel very happy to live in any of them. I'm a fan of all of the countries you just mentioned.
Yeah, they're great places. I mean, if you had to go live someplace else, it would be one of those.
Yeah,
I think
I'd go to Scotland because I don't like humidity, or I don't like heat and humidity. Final question, and this is just sort of a broad overview. I've been reading your books. I don't believe I've read the entire ORourke canon, but I've made a good dent. And I started out reading Parliament of Horrors. Are there any positions you've changed in the last couple of years that you've altered? And also, are you generally optimistic about the future? Where are you at looking forward?
Pretty optimistic. Worried, of course. Worried, but optimistic. Sort of like I in my mind, I treat America very much as I treat my children in my mind. Always worried, always vigilant, fundamentally optimistic.
Okay.
I think America is a country, and when people were running to safe spaces after the 2016 election, I am trying to say America is a lot of keel. America is a surprisingly stable society. We may not know where the boat is going, but it's not going to tip over.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm not quite sure where it's headed. And then again, America isn't about like where America is headed. America is about where each of us want to go.
Right.
It's not a nation with an innate purpose, like some nations I could name, and the purpose doesn't seem to be good. So,
China's got one of those.
I'm cautiously optimistic. And have I changed my ideas? No, but I've changed my willingness to listen to other people a little bit. I haven't experienced any like big volte-face or road to Damascus moments about. I have a kind of a conservative libertarian, slowly evolving set of ideas about things. I mean, yes, that's not quite true. Gay marriage. I thought it was kind of odd and like non-customary, and like I wasn't against it, but I didn't see why civil unions wouldn't do just as well.
Okay. Until
gay friends of mine explained how important they felt this was to their being viewed as fellow members, normal members,
right,
of a broader society. And so I changed my mind, but I think it's mostly been a sort of Keynesian thing, not Keynesian economics, but Keynes was asked once, somebody said, you're terribly inconsistent. You said this back then, you say this now, and he said, when my facts change, I change my opinions. What do you do?
Yeah. And it doesn't sound like the underlying kind of values or logic you have fundamentally altered. It sounds like you find a way to apply them differently depending on when you find different facts on the ground. But
that's what I try to do. But always come back to the individual liberty, individual dignity, and individual responsibility, although I sort of hate the third point.
Well, I thank you for that, and I thank you for the great, glorious body of work that you've given me and the American people to read. As I said, I am a huge fan. I was delighted to have you on the program.
Thank you.
Thank you for so much for coming on.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.
Quick announcement before we finish up the day. This is an announcement from M1. It's a good charity of which I am fond regarding flooding in the Midwest. Mercury One partner Operation Blessing reports that recovery efforts are going well in Nebraska, but they need more people to help. This is the worst natural disaster Nebraska has ever experienced. Out of 93 counties, 79 of them are in a state of emergency. Operation Blessing has set up their volunteer command center at Fremont, I'm not sure, Nazarene Church in Fremont, Nebraska. You can check out their website. Go to www.ob.org for more information on how to help. You can help Mercury One and work alongside their partners who are lifting the human spirit in times of disaster, and they want to thank you for being willing to rescue and rebuild and restore. You can go to mercuryone.org, that's mercuryone.org, to donate to humanitarian relief fund that they have so that they can support brothers and sisters in Nebraska, our friends and our neighbors in Nebraska and beyond. They do good work. I really like them. A little bit of listener feedback. A Bupton, looks like a Bupton, says, Andrew is hilarious, conscientious, kind, and overall awesome. He doesn't play the us or them political game, but rather he digs deeper into the beliefs from people on all sides of any issue. This show reassures me that humanity and the United States are not as doomed as the mainstream media makes it seem. Hey, thank you very much. And I'm filled with buoyant optimism after speaking to Mr. O'Rourke. I think he's right. We got a lot of keel, don't we? Have you guys subscribed to this podcast yet? Have you guys done it? No, I see what's going on here. A couple of you haven't done it yet, and I know what you're doing. You're playing the waiting game. You're trying to make me jealous. You're trying to make me jealous by subscribing to 2 crime podcasts, but not my podcast. Well, you know what? 2 can play at that game because guess what? You're not my only listener. Let that soak in, person who hasn't subscribed to my podcast yet. Here you thought I did this whole thing for you, but in point of fact, 85% of the American public listens to this program multiple times a day. A lot of people just keep it on repeat. So I don't need you, and I don't need your stupid podcast subscription, even though you listen to this entire program for free. If you do come to your senses and you do subscribe to this podcast, which I would do if you had a podcast, maybe check it out on Facebook Watch too. You can gaze upon my handsome mug. You can see that I look like Abraham Lincoln plus whiskey equals awesome. And you can see the picture of PJ O'Rourke that I've got on my wall today. It will tomorrow be in my dressing room, just so you know. If it's gone, don't think that I've dethroned PJ. I've merely returned him to a place of great significance within the work world. Remember, you can always tweet me at Mighty Heaton or Facebook me at facebook.com/Mighty Heaton, or even email me by subscribing to my newsletter at mightyheaton.com and just replying when I send it out on Fridays, if you dare. And as I said, please subscribe, rate, and review the podcast. That helps other people discover this here political orphanage. Thank you, and good day.